We are live. Let's give it a couple seconds. Let me just get everything put together. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you. Welcome back, PM Peeps, to PM Corner. Today will be talking about the Apollo Space Program continuing on. Now, just give me a second. Apologies, everyone. So, as I was saying, we are continuing on the Apollo space program. So, for this stream, we're going to talk about the first 3 flights that were tested. They're unmanned, by the way. And then, of course, unfortunately, we do have already a tragedy for the Apollo space program. That's the Apollo 1, also known as the AS-204 tragedy. So, to begin, if you like what you see, you like the content, what we talk about, covering concepts and so forth, please give a follow on Twitter, Twitch, TikTok, YouTube, and or Patreon. And if you also like to support the effort and the channels, please donate to PayPal, or you can subscribe to Patreon, where you're going to get more benefits such as access to my scripts, my slides, all this stuff, and more. You can also get really cool other stuff too, such as free courses from me, all that fun jazz. Now, before I begin in talking about the topics and the subjects that we're going to look at, if you have any questions, please save them before, or keep them in the chat or somehow, but just know that I'm not going to read them right away. I will do pauses in between to say, hey, okay, do you have any questions before we proceed on and answer your questions? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, I'm going to cover a few PMP moments. First off, we're going to recall the difference between a project versus a program. So, very briefly, we talked about this in the last stream, where a project, by definition per the PMBOK, is a temporary endeavor with a defined beginning and end that creates a product, service, and or result. Now, of course, that means that we're got something that we're going to make right away. You know, the length of a project doesn't really matter because it's as defined by its start and it's temporary. Whereas a program, on the other hand, that's where things become a little more vague. Your scope may be vague or not really defined, but you do know what your business value is. And that was the whole thing about the Apollo space program, was that their business value was already defined. So they know what they're supposed to do, which, of course, if we recall from the previous stream, was to put a man on the moon. So, it's quite a big feat of a business value, in my opinion. Now, we didn't cover risk management in the last stream, but if you go back to the nuclear bunker stream, we did discuss risk management. Now, risk management, of course, is heavily in the planning phase of a project, where we look at, how we're going to plan, manage, monitor, and control and respond to risks, then identify them, excuse me, also perform quantitative and qualitative risk analysis, and then also to do risk response planning, which then, after you've done all that, you then monitor your risks. You see if they're getting resolved through the work you're doing, etc. And if a risk does occur, you then implement the risk response. And for the case of the Apollo space program, you definitely increase the risk over time. Well, not over time. It's a huge risk because we have to consider safety, especially your astronauts. How well is the cabin like sealed, for example? You make sure there's no, oxygen leaks. Nothing of that nature. We're going to briefly talk about that again once we talk about, of course, the Apollo 1 tragedy. But overall, throughout the entirety of this program, there is a huge risk because, again, rockets could explode on accident. If we remember from the Challenger space shuttle, when it lifted off, it exploded, right? So that was a huge risk, was if we don't do our due diligence in making sure that things are properly right, this is going to potentially happen. So we got to mitigate that, which of course leads into now a new PMP moment topic, which is quality management. Now, quality management is basically how we going to manage and monitor the quality of the product, service, or result that we're making. Okay, so in the PMBOK, quality management doesn't have a lot of planning per se. But the thing about quality management is you have to take the time to still understand and also to decide and determine what kind of metrics, standards, um, types of quality expectations. Okay, because it's not just standards from like industry and government. It could also be quality management standards from your client, their expectation. One prime example about quality management is, your client may have a lower standard, but the industry would have a higher standard. And that can happen, which is perfectly fine, but it's also important to keep it in mind because as you're planning, you then have to determine, okay, well, how much quality management oversight do I want to have? What kinds of metrics, techniques do I want to implement? And like in cost management, where they talk about the cost of risk, which is how much is going to cost me to do risk management, you also have to look at the cost of quality. And part of the reason is that in software development, particularly, you tend to run into defects. So if you don't take the time to implement any kind of quality management protocols, standards, whatever, you'll have a higher likelihood of facing or finding defects in the software that your developers develop versus if you implement it. Now, that also doesn't mean, though, that you make those processes difficult, strenuous, or whatever. You obviously have to tailor that to the needs of your program or project. And that, of course, also plays a role when we talk about the Apollo project or the Apollo program and in their various missions. And then lastly, all projects have successes and failures. And we're going to see that with the Apollo space program in this stream and maybe potentially in other streams outside of course, this particular program. But lessons learned is essential to project management. As you recall from the very first stream, this was one of the 7 key items that we always keep in mind is the lessons learned. Why? The lessons learned helps future projects see what past projects did and say, we ain't doing that, or we should try that but maybe better, or that completely worked all around and we're going to implement that ourselves. And that's the point of lessons learned. And you will see throughout the Apollo space program, they definitely do take lessons learned. Again, I know we're going to talk about a tragedy, but that is a form of a lessons learned, and we're going to see that after, of course, what happens with the accident and so forth. Now, of course, before I begin, I'm going to just pause and I'm just going to see if anyone has any questions. I don't see anything in the chat, so of course, let's go ahead and continue on. So first off, let's just cover the summary of the Apollo space program. These are just highlights. Obviously, this was conceived in 1960 under Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidency, but of course, he was then, president, and then the president after, which was John F. Kennedy, he took over the presidency, and of course, he had his hesitancies about the Apollo space program, but at the end of the day, he was pushing for NASA to send a man to the moon and get on the moon. Additionally, from Britannica, Encyclopedia Britannica, Apollo, the project conducted by the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration in the 1960s and 70s, that landed the first humans on the moon. All told, 24 Apollo astronauts visit the moon and 12 of them walked on its surface. Additional NASA astronauts were scheduled to return to the moon by 2025 as part of the Artemis space program, which, if you were paying attention to Twitter today, NASA's account talked about that. And I got really excited when I saw it because they're going to send a rover. I don't remember the rover's name, but they're going to send a rover onto space so that they can start really mapping the surface of the moon. How cool is that? I'm really excited. That's almost, I mean, that's almost 2 years away with with Artemis space program. It's exciting. Now, of course, Artemis space program has the Apollo space program to go back on. Again, remember, lessons learned. They can look at the lessons learned from the Apollo space program and say, okay, not that. Or, okay, yes, that. Or, maybe that with, a little twist. Something along those lines. Now, the first 3 flights we're going to talk about are what is considered unmanned flights. So, what the Apollo space program first started doing was trying to make some kind of rocket that then could, send basically people to the moon. So they had to do a lot of testing. So let's first start off with AS201. So AS201 is the first uncrewed spaceflight test of a production Apollo command and service module. This plays a huge role. And it plays a huge role, of course, in the unfortunate tragedy of Apollo 1. And it's the first to launch the Saturn IB rocket. So there was the Project Mercury, that's where this rocket was from what I was seeing in my research. And so, of course, when Apollo space program started, they said, okay, well, we need to take this rocket and then we need to add something else to it so that we can have people in it. Now, of course, in the previous stream, I was seeing it a lot in my research for the program overall that they were kind of already starting the build of the CSM, or the Command and Service Module. And so this was something they were going to add on to the Saturn space rocket. So AS201 was a pioneering mission towards meeting John F. Kennedy's mission to land a man on the moon. So the purpose of this flight, this very first flight, was to demonstrate of the combined Apollo command module and the service module. The second production Apollo capsule of the CM-009 and the first production service model of SM-009 were launched by the first Saturn IB SA-201. Okay, so that's the type of rocket and so forth that they were putting on there. Additionally, the other purpose was to test all components of a system in a single first flight. Suborbital test flight was to demonstrate the Saturn IB rocket's capabilities, successful integration of rocket and spaceship components, operation of the Apollo service module's main engine, and effectiveness of the command module's heat shield. So these were the purposes. So obviously, if something went wrong with this one, they'd be like, okay, well, we learned better, which they did. So this one had a little bit of an issue of its own. But of course, this was unmanned, so, whatever. It's just material. It's fine. So, in the building of it, the first flight of the Saturn IB rocket, the most powerful rocket up to that time, with a first stage thrust of 1.6 million pounds, built on the 10 successful launches of its predecessors, because remember, we had, we had Mercury before Apollo. The Saturn 1 rocket between 1961 and 1965, the Saturn IB used 8 upgraded H1 engines on its SIB first stage, but the most significant improvement over its predecessor involved the use of a new upper stage called the SIVB, powered by a single J2 engine using liquid hydrogen as its fuel. The larger Saturn V rocket used a version of the SIVB stage to complete orbital insertion of the Apollo space program, and more importantly, to send it out of Earth's orbit and towards the moon. Again, lessons learned. So you had Mercury, you had the first predecessor rockets, right? So they took that and they said, okay, so here's some lessons learned from the previous rockets. This is what we need to change. This is what we need to do. This is how we need to upgrade it in order to be able to make this successful. And of course, in addition to that, the command and service module, so the CSM 009 was a Block 1 version designed before the Lunar Orbital Orbit Rendezvous method was chosen for the Apollo lunar landing. So if we recall back in the first stream for the Apollo space program overall, they had those different approaches that they wanted to consider, and it just depended on what they really needed to do. So of course they were kind of like not there yet at this point when they were first doing test flights. So therefore it lacked capability to dock with a lunar module. Block 1 also employed preliminary designs of certain subsystems and was heavier than the Block 2 version with the lunar mission capability. All previous command and service modules flown, with one exception, were boilerplate versions. So, and we're going to see this when we talk about the Apollo 1 tragedy, that once that occurred, they decided to go with the second version that was a much better version anyways, just due to the fact that, what had happened to, of course, during the testing of the Apollo 1. So that's the whole point of this. But again, lessons learned. This is what I'm going to keep emphasizing throughout this entire stream until I'm blue in the face, and you can be mad at me all you want about it. But this is where we're taking a lot of lessons learned, okay? And so when we get to the day of launch, so it was launched on February 26th of 1966. The Saturn IB rocket lifted off successfully, and its two stages placed the Apollo spacecraft into a suborbitable trajectory. The Apollo capsule reached a maximum altitude of 305.8 miles and landed near Ascension Island in South Atlantic Ocean, 5,267 miles from Cape Canaveral. Total duration of the flight was 37 minutes, 19.7 seconds. And after separation and re-entry, the command module splashed down 5,264 miles downrange after the successful flight, which was great. So we were able to send it off. We were able to do what we needed to do for 37 minutes, and then it came back down. And so we said, okay, here we go. Lessons learned. Again, lessons learned. Documenting, documenting, documenting. Now, there were two problems technically there were three problems on the flight. So there were three problems encountered on the flight. Thank you for subscribing, much appreciated. The service module's engine worked properly for only 80 seconds, interrupted by the presence of helium pressurant gas in the combustion chamber. Helium was used to pressurize the fuel tanks but should not have been in the combustion chamber. This was caused by a break in the oxidizer line that allowed helium to mix with the oxidizer. The second problem was the electrical system failure, which caused the command module to lose steering control during re-entry. So this is why, the CSM was like totally miles away from where it should have been because of that. And so both problems were found to be due to incorrect wiring and were easily fixed. So again, lessons learned. They did the rewiring. They said, okay, we need to fix this up. We need to make sure that this is fixed and rewired properly so that we don't have this issue again. Now, before I continue on to the next next two flights that were unmanned, does anyone have any questions? No? Okay. So we're going to continue on to the next two flights. Now I've kind of combined them because there's not a whole lot of information. They're pretty successful. Obviously, this is again the unmanned flights, but the big one is going to be obviously the Apollo 1 tragedy. So the next two flights was AS-202 and AS-203. So AS-202 also referred to as SA-202, was the second uncrewed suborbital test flight of a production Block 1 Apollo command and service module launch with the Saturn IB launch vehicle. It was launched on August 25th of 1966 and was the first flight which included the spacecraft guidance, navigation control system, and fuel cells. The success of this flight enabled the Apollo program to judge the Block 1 spacecraft and Saturn IB ready to carry men into orbit on the next mission, AS-204. As AS-202 was the third test flight of the Saturn IB because the delay in readiness of the Apollo spacecraft 011 pushed its launch past the July 1966 launch of AS-203. So technically what was supposed to happen was there was going to be another flight that was supposed to happen before the unmanned flight of AS-203, but that didn't happen. It was designed to test the rocket more than had been done as AS-201 by launching the rocket higher and having the flight lasting twice as long. It would also test the command and service module again, so the CSM-011, by having the engine fire 4 times during the flight. So that was the whole point of AS-202. AS-203 was an uncrewed flight as well of the Saturn IB rocket on July 5th, 1966. It carried no command and service module, as its purpose was to verify the design of the SIVB rocket stage restart capability that would later be used in the Apollo program to boost astronauts from Earth orbit to a trajectory towards the moon. It achieved its objectives, but the stage was inadvertently destroyed after 4 orbits. Okay, again, not too bad. Lessons learned, it was an unmanned flight. The purpose of the AS-203 flight was to investigate the effects of weightlessness on the liquid hydrogen fuel in the SIVB-200 second stage tank. The lunar missions would use a modified version of the SIVB-200, the SIVB-500, as the third stage of the Saturn V launch vehicle. This called for stage to fire briefly to put the spacecraft into a parking Earth orbit before restarting the engine for flight to the moon. To design this capability, engineers needed to verify that the anti-slosh measures designed to control the hydrogen's location in the tank were adequate and that the fuel lines and engines would be kept at the proper temperatures to allow engine restart. Which 10 out of 10, 100% great. So again, like we talked about earlier about quality management, right? That was a form of quality management by saying, okay, we need to make sure that it meets certain anti-slosh measures, right? That's a form of quality because again, they were trying to get the spaceship and rocket to kind of work in a way that could get these men to the moon. So huge important point of that. And then again, the lessons learned, what happened during that flight. And very important to document, very important to reference back to. And again, like I got very excited about the Artemis program that's coming up. They're going to have a lot of great lessons learned. Now, before, of course, we get to the next slide, which is, of course, about the Apollo 1, I will go ahead and stop and see if anyone had any questions. No, I don't see any. So we're going to go ahead and continue on to now Apollo 1. Now, before we begin, I do want you to take a moment to see these 3 men's faces. It's very sad and tragic, and take a moment of silence. So this is Apollo 1. It's also known as AS-204. Apollo 1 was not the first name. So the crew was Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaffee. Their selection announcement was on March 21st of 1966. The flight they were supposed to take was supposed to happen on February 21st of 1967. The accident occurred on January 27th, 1967. So the purpose was AS-204, also known as Apollo 1, was to be the first crewed flight of the Apollo CSM to Earth orbit and launch on the Saturn IB rocket. So this wasn't really to get to the moon necessarily. This was to see it get at least launched and into Earth's orbit. So, of course, leading up to the accident, the CSM for this flight, number 012, was built by North American Aviation, NAA, was a Block 1 version designed before the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous landing strategy was chosen. Therefore, it lacked capability of docking with the lunar module. This was incorporated into the Block 2 CSM design along with lessons learned on Block 1. Block 2 would be test flown with the LM when the latter was ready. So this one had the Block 1, and of course they learned their lesson afterwards and used the Block 2. In March, NASA was studying the possibility of flying the first Apollo mission as a joint space rendezvous with the final Project Gemini mission, Gemini 12, in November 1966. But by May, delays in making Apollo ready for flight just by itself and the extra time needed to incorporate capability with the Gemini made that impractical. This became moot when slippage in readiness of the AS-204 spacecraft caused the last quarter of 1966 target date to be missed, and the mission was rescheduled for February 21st of 1967. So, unfortunately, kind of like the, Space Challenger situation, you again had issues, which, I mean, getting on any project that you're trying to do something new, when are you not going to run into issues? So of course that, makes a big deal in the first place because you already have acknowledgement of problems. So this is a moment to also acknowledge the risk, right? So there is a huge risk that comes to putting people into space and especially going to the moon. And because of that, it needs to be documented. Now, I don't think this could be one of those risks where you're just like, we just have to accept it. But to some degree, if they're in space, you kind of have to accept it. But um, unfortunately, these men didn't even get to space. But with these issues arising, it was a good thing that, unlike with the Challenger, at least NASA was trying to address these issues and really try to, get things together. So, of course, in October 1966, NASA announced the flight would carry a small television camera to broadcast live from the command module. The camera would also be used to allow flight controllers to monitor the spacecraft instrument panel in flight. Television cameras were carried aboard all crewed Apollo missions, which really is cool. Because again, they're trying to document where they went, and that makes perfect sense. You want to prove, yeah, we actually went there, which is interesting when people talk about how the moon landing is a conspiracy theory and never happened kind of deal. It's very funny. The Apollo Command and Service Module was much bigger and far more complex than any previous manned spacecraft. Well, no duh. It's going to be extremely um, complex in the first place. This is something that hasn't really been done before. Now, of course, previously they did like one manned, but no one really went to the moon. So, yeah, you're talking how you got to get there, what you got to do, all that jazz. And that's very big and complex, which again leads back into your risk management, your risk analysis, risk, mitigation strategies, response strategies, what to be prepared for, unknown unknowns, right? That's what the reserves are for, and contingencies are for known unknowns, right? So, of course, I just can think of numerous projects I've been on that were just so complex. And when you start doing something that hasn't been done before, it it always seems like it's not that complex because you think you got previous data to kind of help you. But when it's something on this magnitude, it's quite different once you really start getting into it. But I digress. In October of 1963, Joseph S. Shea was named Apollo Spacecraft Program Office, right? So this is before they, officially, made it come to life. This is, of course, during Dwight D. Eisenhower, right? Responsible for managing the design and construction of both the CSM and the LM. In spacecraft review meeting held with Shea on August 19, 1966, a week before delivery, the crew expressed concern about the amount of flammable material, mainly nylon netting and Velcro, in the cabin, which both astronauts and technicians found convenient for holding tools and equipment in place. Although Shea gave the spacecraft a passing grade, after the meeting they gave him a crew portrait they had posed with heads bowed and hands clasped in prayer with the inscription, "It isn't that we don't trust you, Joe, but this time we've decided to go over your head." And Shea gave his staff orders to tell North American to remove the flammables from the cabin, but did not supervise the issue personally. So, this is kind of a PMP moment here. As a leader, you do not ignore concerns of those you lead, okay? Or even as someone that has influence as a stakeholder. Ignoring people's concern is a huge problem. So, like the Challenger space shuttle, where the engineers were saying to their management and to NASA, hey, like, this is concerning. This hasn't been passing tests, blah, 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 blah. And then, if you recall from that specific stream, the management, the contractor's management was first at the beginning like, yeah, we shouldn't be doing this, we need to delay the flight, but then some weird magical meeting happened outside of that, and you guarantee that was some bureaucracy and politics and nonsense of its own, that when they came back they were like, oh yeah, well, it was not a big deal, whatever, we're just gonna go through with it. And then look what happened. Big deal. So you already have the crew members saying like, I don't know about this. Like, this looks flammable. Like, because again, risk management, right? So there is the potential that this could light on fire for any reason, due to a leak, due to electrical, flame, or whatever could cause a fire. And the fact that, okay, he hears them out, but he doesn't even supervise to see if things have been removed is grossly negligent in many ways, because it's saying, okay, yeah. It's like the people where you tell them like, hey, there's a fire going on. And they're like, yeah, whatever. Okay, fine. I'll take care of it. But they don't make sure that it's actually taken care of. It's crazy to me. And when I read that, and I was mind boggled, because I'm sitting there thinking to myself, well, if this guy had just made sure, maybe we'd have had less of a problem. Maybe these three gentlemen that we see on the screen would be alive, and actually have lived long lives or something, right? But again, I can't, it's negligent to not ensure that it was done. But again, we don't know all the ins and outs. We just have what we have in terms of information. Now, before I continue on, does anyone have any questions? Because I kind of went on a diatribe for a minute. Nope. Okay. So, moving on. So, North American shipped spacecraft CM-012 to Kennedy Space Center on August 26, 1966, under a conditional certificate of flight worthiness. Conditional. Oh my. 113 significant incomplete planned engineering changes had to be completed at KSC, which is Kennedy Space Center, but that was not all. An additional 623 engineering change orders were made and completed after delivery. See, this is the nonsense that just boggles my mind when it comes to any government entity. The partial solution there, but it doesn't really fully work. It's kind of like the concept of, we got the 25% that is of business value, but the rest of it is not done. Like, it doesn't make sense. If I want to test something that is supposed to go in flight, particularly in space, I want to know that everything is in there. The fact that they had 623 change requests, again, this is why integrated change control is so important. Because integrated change control ensures that we actually did our due diligence as a project managers and as a project team, that we have planned appropriately and accordingly to avoid all kinds of changes, even including the scope. And that's insane. Like 623 changes you had to implement after delivery. That wasn't a real delivery. But again, of course they said a conditional certificate of flight worthiness, which how could you really consider that flight worthy with a condition? Like, that it either can fly or it doesn't. Like, I don't know why a conditional certificate of flight worthiness. It's funny. Anyways, I'm going to move on. The command and service modules were mated in the KSC altitude chamber in September, and combined system testing was performed. Altitude testing was performed first uncrewed, then with both the prime and backup crew from October 10 through December 30th. Oh yeah, by the way, I failed to mention this. I'm just going to pause for a second. So there were other crews besides the main crew we see on the screen. So they had a couple backup crews just in case like one of them got sick or something along those lines. During this testing, the environmental control unit in the command module was found to have a design flaw and was sent back to the manufacturer for design changes and rework. Well, thank God they tested that in the first place and figured that out ahead of time. Don't know if that made a change or an impact, but we're going to find out. The returned ECU then leaked water and glycol coolant and had to be returned a second time. I mean, see, this is the thing. This is another thing about changes and implementing, upgrades or changes or whatever. It's like anything else. Do it right the first time. You're already in it. Make sure everything's good. Don't just send something back and then it's all of a sudden leaking and causing problems. It's like getting your car back after it's been through a tune-up and already it's like leaking all the oil. Well, it makes no sense. Anyways. Also during this time, a propellant tank and another service module had ruptured during testing at NAA, prompting the removal from the KSC test chamber of the service module so it could be tested for signs of the tank problem. These tests were negative. Great. See, you could have avoided all of these problems if you just implemented even better quality management protocols, and then you would avoid going through integrated change control 20 times and not be late to things, right? What do I know? I don't know anything. Once all outstanding CSM 012 hardware problems had been fixed and the reassembled spacecraft completed a successful altitude chamber test with Shircha backup crew on December 30th. According to the final report of the Accident Investigation Board, so yeah, by the way, after the accident, they do investigate. At the post-test debriefing, the backup flight crew expressed their satisfaction with the condition and performance of the spacecraft. Which, in fact, the sources that I looked at, they kind of talked about how it maybe potentially wasn't that case. Like, they started having not so good feelings about it afterwards. But, who knows. After the successful altitude test, the spacecraft was removed from the altitude chamber on January 3, 1967, and mated to its Saturn IB launch vehicle on Pad 34 on January 6. Grissom said in a February 1963 interview that NASA could not eliminate risk despite precautions. So, in risk management, there's really no such thing as completely being rid of a risk. You could mitigate it to such a degree that it doesn't cause you problems, but it's still there. It just maybe doesn't impact you as badly and like before. So the whole thought process of eliminating a risk just doesn't pass the vibe check. Just going to say that. And so it's really interesting that they say says an awful lot of people have devoted more effort than I can describe to make Project Mercury. So this is about Project Mercury and its successors as safe as humanly possible. But we also recognize that there remains a great deal of risk, especially in initial operations, regardless of planning. You just can't forecast all the things that could happen or when they could happen. And again, in part of risk management, this is why we have, contingency and reserve analysis, right? There's a point to that, and that is because we can identify the known unknowns, but the unknown unknowns are unknown unknowns for a reason. It's because we don't know if they really are there until we're actually in the weeds of doing the project or program, however you want to go about it, right? So to make that kind of statement, I mean, yeah, I get where they're coming from, but that's the whole point of risk management in the first place, right? You are to identify as much of your risk as you can. Just like in, Agile, we try to identify as much of our scope, but we also acknowledge that scope can kind of adjust and change over time based on the needs of the client as well. I know some Agile fundamentalists might get mad at me for that statement, but whatever. It's not my problem. But of course, he does still make a good point. You can't predict everything. Although you can try and prevent, I mean, there were a lot of issues with Apollo 1. So many issues. So many changes. So many problems. And yet, we're going to get to the accident now. Okay, so this was a launch simulation, by the way. This was not them getting into flight, because remember, that was supposed to be in February. The launch simulation on January 27, 1967, on Pad 34 was a plugs out test to determine whether the spacecraft would operate nominally on simulated internal power while detached from all cables and the umbilicals. Passing this test was essential to making the February 21st launch date. The test was considered non-hazardous because neither the launch vehicle nor the spacecraft was loaded with fuel or carcinogenics, and all pyrotechnic systems, explosive bolts, were disabled. The crew members were using the time to run through their checklist again when a momentary increase in AC bus 2 voltage occurred. So, before I continue on in describing this accident, they did have a recording of the accident, like not a video recording, but a voice recording. I didn't listen to it because, I don't think I could handle hearing that. But some of the things they heard in that recording was fire, fire, and these men suffered horrendous deaths. And the other problem is too, which you can Google on your own time, although I don't really recommend doing that. They do have photos of these men's bodies, not like their bodies out, but their bodies were in the suits. Because again, they were doing a simulated test flight, and it was just it's a lot to digest. But continuing on, the heat of the fire fed by pure oxygen caused the pressure to rise to 29 psi, which ruptured the command module's inner walls. Flame and gases then rushed outside the command module through open access panels to 2 levels of the pad's service structure. The intense heat, dense smoke, and ineffective gas masks designed for toxic fumes rather than smoke hampered the ground crew's attempt to rescue the men. There were fears the command module had exploded or soon would, and that the fire might ignite the solid fuel rocket in the launch escape tower above the command module, which would have likely killed nearby ground personnel and possibly have destroyed the pad. Yeah, that's rough. I just can't imagine being burned alive. I think that's one of those things that it's like drowning and being burned alive, like the slow, painful death. Um, sorry, I got a little emotional right there. Just imagine what people do for science, and we should honor these men, even though they didn't expect to sacrifice their lives. They took this risk. And in the sources, there are memorials to these men, um, specifically, and there was a lot of consequence after that. So, the cause of the accident officially. So, as I said, they did investigations of the accident. So, the same thing that they did for the Challenger space shuttle, they also did an investigation of the Apollo 1 tragedy to see and understand like what happened, what went wrong. So, the review board identified several major factors which combined the cause which combined to cause the fire and the astronauts' death. So yeah, they yeah. An ignition source most probably related to vulnerable wiring carrying spacecraft power and vulnerable plumbing carrying a combustible and corrosive coolant. A pure oxygen atmosphere at higher than atmospheric pressure. A cabin sealed with a hatch cover which could not be quickly removed at high pressure. An extensive distribution of combustible material in the cabin. So we kind of know that wasn't really resolved from earlier, where they expressed concerns like, hey, it looks like we got combustible stuff in here. Obviously, that wasn't removed. Inadequate emergency preparedness. So, meaning like rescue or medical assistance in crew escape. There was just no preparedness, which again, that's the whole point of risk management is to have a mitigation plan in place as to if X were to occur, what is the response? It's more than just a mitigate or avoid or transfer or insure it. It's also about what you're going to do in the process of doing that. You know, what are you going to do in the process of mitigating? What are you going to do in the process of avoiding, accepting, whatever? So the fact that they weren't even prepared is also pretty shocking. Guess that wasn't documented in the lessons learned. Then again, you have people's lives on the line that you need to take in consideration. So, of course, in the aftermath, as mentioned, they did investigations. But prior to, and this is interesting, prior to the Apollo 1 fire, there were other investigations into the quality schedule and other factors of concern. And this was kind of mentioned briefly. They were because again, it's government money, so at this point they kind of act their act together about their money. Um and so they're kind of going, okay, well, what's going on with all these quality issues? What's happening? Why are you behind schedule? What is going on? That's the whole point of project management with managed, stakeholder engagement is communicating things like that, which, we're all human, we're imperfect, we don't communicate well sometimes. Sometimes if we don't have 2 or 3 cups of coffee, things fall through the cracks. You won't want bad things to fall through the cracks, but things fall through the cracks. After the fire, of course, the Apollo program was grounded for review and redesign. The command module was found to be extremely hazardous and in some instances carelessly assembled. For example, a misplaced wrench socket was found in the cabin. No surprise, since they couldn't even remove the flammable material. So again, it being carelessly assembled is even bigger problems. Thank God they didn't go to space. It was decided that remaining Block 1 spacecraft would be used only for uncrewed Saturn V test flights. All crewed missions would use the Block 2 spacecraft, to which many command module design changes were made. So, as kind of mentioned earlier, they did say that the Block 2 spacecraft, CSM, was going to be the one that does all the lunar, orbits and landings and so forth because of this accident, because of this fire, because of this issue. So, of course, they did a lot of great changes because, again, lessons learned. I mean, if they didn't learn from this lesson, well, okay. I mean, we can look at the Challenger Space Shuttle and the Columbia and say, it doesn't look like they really learned their lesson. But in this case, they took their lessons learned and said, okay, this is what needed to be do. So for the Block 2, they adjusted cabin atmosphere. Astronauts' pressure suits was not changed. So the suits, I guess, were fine. I don't think the suits were the issue. Is more about the actual cabin itself. Nylon used originally was replaced with beta cloth, which was non-flammable. Redesigned the hatch, which opened outward. Flammable material replaced with self-extinguishing versions, so ones that wouldn't, continue to burn. And plumbing and wiring were covered with protective insulation. So that was their lessons learned for the Apollo 1. And as I said, these men do have a memorial. They had changed the name. I don't remember why they changed it from AS-204 to Apollo 1, but they did in honor of these men and what happened and so forth. And of course, the horrible death that they endured. So again, this though will be the predecessor of all the manned crewed flights afterwards from what they learned, and so implementing the Block 2 CSM spacecraft instead so that they wouldn't have a repeat of this. Now, before I show the references, I just want to take a moment and check and see if there are any questions. I don't see anything. Okay. Well, I'm just going to come over to the reference slide. So these are my references. Of course, if you follow me on Patreon and you're subscribed, you would be able to access these references from not only my slide deck, but also from my script as well. So I hope that you enjoyed this particular stream. I know it had a little bit of a sad and dark ending. But again, life is not always pretty. It's like the Manhattan Project. That wasn't pretty either, what had to happen. But with that said, I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you, PM Peeps, for joining, and I will see you all in the next stream.